So I just discovered that I have been doing something wrong for years with oil paints, and chances are if you're watching this video, you have too. Hi, hello, I'm Kelsey, and this channel is all about oil painting and my journey to become a full-time independent artist. So there is a significant chance that you found me and my channel via my video on non-toxic oil painting. It's the highest performing video on my channel by far. It has almost 5,000 views. I don't know, it has over 5,000 views actually. And it's quickly growing and it will soon surpass 6,000. I talked about the toxicity of cadmium pigments in that video briefly, not at length, and I want to address it more specifically in this video because I have been disposing of my oil paints and cleaning my brushes incorrectly for ages, and so I wanted to clear that up and just really own that mistake and correct it for the future, and also just inform you guys what the proper procedures are for disposing of cadmium oil paints and cleaning your brushes so no one makes the same mistake in the future. Pigments used in oil paints, be it traditional or water mixable, are ground with the specific size and formulation that they aren't easily absorbed into your skin. So unless you eat them or have an incredibly high exposure to them over a really long period of time, way beyond the normal use, then you would never suffer from ill effects. According to the Winsor & Newton website, transforming the cadmium metal into a usable pigment involves it undergoing several carefully controlled chemical reactions and procedures using ingredients including mineral acids, sodium sulfide flakes, water, and selenium. Toward the end of the process, heating takes place to create the pigment, and it is in this heating process the quality and hue of the final pigment begins to form. The emerging pigment is then ground down into tiny particles, and the grinding process affects the way the pigment interacts with light. And while cadmium itself is a heavy metal and is toxic, cadmium pigments are not classified as dangerous for use in line with the EC classification. The level of soluble cadmium in the pigments is so low that no hazard warnings are needed, and they pose no greater risk after swallowing or breathing in than other pigment types. What this means is that unless you are sanding down a dry painting and inhaling that pigment dust, you have no direct harm from using these paints whatsoever. Unfortunately, what Winsor & Newton doesn't tell you is what happens when you clean your brushes. So there is real danger to using cadmium paints when you clean your brushes and let that wastewater go down the drain. Blogger and artist Dan Schultz writes on his blog when talking about this interview that he went to with M. Graham's factory that he asked specifically about the toxicity of cadmium colors. They assured him at the factory that there's no harm to humans using this paint. You can rub it on your skin, and unless you have enormously high exposure or breathe in that dust, you're totally fine. The process that they use to make the paint renders the cadmium insoluble in water, which greatly limits the absorption into the human body. This is standard. But he does talk about how the same manufacturers advised him to not pour your dirty brush cleaning water or solvent down the drain or onto the ground. Washing those heavy metal pigments down the drain can create problems downstream in the watershed, so marine animals and agricultural practices be adversely affected by the presence of cadmium pigments in the water. So I was reading that blog post and I became really interested in how prevalent this is and how important it is to wash your cadmium paint on your brushes in a separate method than just down the drain. So I started researching a little bit, and what I found was that while you shouldn't wash cadmium pigments that are on your brushes down the drain, regular practices like washing your car, etc., introduces far more heavy chemicals into the water than regular artist practices. I discovered several articles where the European Union was considering, I think this was 2014, 2016, they were considering a rule that would have severely limited the use of cadmium pigments in a wide variety of products, but including artist pigments. The artist community really lobbied very hard against them being included in this rule because cadmium pigments are really great. They're incredibly light fast. I use them all the time in my work, but I had no idea that they could be toxic in the watershed downstream once I had properly cleaned my brushes. The EU eventually ended up dropping this rule once a study came out that I will link below in the description that showed how other sources of cadmium pollution like car washes were far more substantial than regular artist practices. But this introduction to the waterway is still significant, even if it's not very much or even comparable to car washes, and it can be easily avoided by not washing your brushes using regular tap water. So I discovered that I had been making a mistake for ages and that no one had actually told me that this was wrong. I've received instruction at the college level in painting, and I never received any word from my instructors this was not the way to go. And from what I can tell, water mixable oils actually do still have cadmium pigments in them if you buy the things that aren't labeled as hue. For example, this is Cadmium Red Deep Hue from the Holbein Duo Aqua line. These are a brand of water mixable oil paints. I've talked about them a bunch before. I will link those videos up in the card above. But basically, these paints, the Cadmium Red Deep Hue, notice the hue in there, so you aren't going to get that same pigment. You are going to get something that performs similarly, but is not the same thing. This uses pigment PR170. Pigment PR170 is actually Naphthol red. You can buy Naphthol red advertised just as it is in other paint brands, but if you see something like hue, then you are not going to get a cadmium, you are going to get something that performs similarly, but it's not the same thing. But Holbein's Duo Aqua line also offers regular cadmium paints that do contain cadmium in them, so they are not as non-toxic as they appear, and I talk about that a bunch in a video sort of debunking that whole non-toxic kind of claim at length if you want to check that out. But I do want to mention that there is a solution. You can continue to use cadmium paints in your workflow. There's just a simple thing that you have to do to adapt, and it might seem like it's a little bit tedious, but I think it is actually worth it. And basically what you want to do is you want to get a jar. This is going to be like a silica oil kind of jar. It should have like a little bit of a coil, metal coil at the bottom. You could also just use a regular jar. For example, I've collected this one. It used to have salsa in it, and now it is clean. And what you need to do is just have a brush cleaning kind of fluid in there. You probably have one lying around if you are an oil painter, but if you don't, you can easily get one. Chelsea Classical Studio, for example, I talk about them a lot. They have an orange and lavender spike oil brush cleaner that I haven't personally tried, but I will be trying soon as a result of this video and this research. And essentially what you want to do is just clean your brushes in that water, or in that like brush cleaning fluid. And if you buy the jars that have like the coil at the bottom, the coil, and sort of rubbing your brush in that coil with that fluid, gets off all of the paint, and then you rub that onto your rag, your oil painting rag that should be dust free, and then you can just clean your brush as normal because all of the cadmium pigment should be gone and the brush should be clean. This is just a simple thing that you can do to reduce your environmental impact and make sure that you are not introducing any toxic chemicals into the watershed. And while the studies that I looked at emphasized that artist activity isn't introducing a lot of toxicity into the watershed, and that really industrial practices are far more harmful to the environment, I still think that action on climate change and environmental pollution is a thing that like individual people and consumers need to emphasize in their lives. You should be doing what you can to reduce your impact as long as it doesn't like really adversely affect your life. And small changes like this aren't really that tedious, I think personally, and they can sort of alleviate your conscience in terms of your environmental impact. And what I want to talk about next is actually cadmium-free paints. So this is Utrecht's cadmium-free red light. This is a paint that is supposed to perfectly mimic cadmium paints, but is not cadmium. And here I have cadmium red light, and then I also have cadmium yellow medium, just because I knew that I had the cadmium versions of these lying around and I could easily compare and contrast them. So that's what we're going to be doing for the rest of this video. It's going to be sort of a semi-review. We're going to compare how they act on their own and also in color mixing. Color mixing is incredibly important when considering what paint to get. And honestly, if these don't perform as expected, and if they aren't actually comparable, then I would probably advise you to stick with the cadmium versions, but I'm going to hold that on my judgment until we have actually compared them, and then I will let you know what I think. So without further ado, let's compare these guys and see how they react together. All right, here we are. We've got the Utrecht paints right here, the Gamblin paints right here. I've got my Toxicity mediums if I need to break anything down, our soft mixing white, and the phthalo blue. And then I will also be using 2 different brushes to compare these paints just because I don't want any bleed over. And then I have oil painting paper right here. This is from Arches, and we have our disposable paint palette. I'm only using this because all of my glass ones are full with other paint because I'm working on a bunch of different projects right now, so just bear with me. It's gonna be a little messy, but we're gonna be fine. So without further ado, let's squeeze out just a little bit of that cadmium yellow medium. And of course, I immediately lose the cap. Okay, here's the cap. Putting that back on. And then we're gonna squeeze out some of this cadmium-free red light. That's gonna go over here. I'm noticing that, and maybe this is because I'm opening these paints for the first time, but they are pretty oily. I think the Gamblin oil paints are, first of all, much harder to open. And second of all, like much stiffer, I think. So I'm gonna squeeze out that cadmium red light over there. And this is actually cadmium yellow deep. But I want a perfect comparison, so we're gonna switch that out for cadmium yellow medium. That was my mistake for not noticing that. All right. And that's gonna be our cadmium yellow medium. So first off, I just wanna swatch these colors. The first thing that I'm noticing is that this one looks like a little bit darker. The cadmium-free one looks a little bit darker, more like an Indian yellow or something than I would really expect from like a cadmium yellow medium. It looks much more like a cadmium yellow deep. So the first thing that I'm noticing is that I do like the texture that these paints have. They don't feel like duo aqua paints, which is good because they aren't. But they do have a nice texture to them. I like sort of the buttery feeling. I think the contrast between the yellow is pretty significant. This one has a much more orangey tint to it than this one does. And they are both supposed to be cadmium yellow, either the real thing or an imitation. But yeah, I mean, I can definitely tell the difference there. I think this one looks a little bit colder than that one does. I think the reds are decently similar, but again, I am noticing a little bit of a difference. I think that this red, again, looks a little bit warmer than this one does. All right, so now I'm going to squeeze out some white and some blue, and we're going to be doing some color mixing as a means of comparison. It does initially appear like the regular cadmium paint does have like significantly more tinting strength. It's taking me quite a lot of white to get it to like even the same level. I'm gonna stop there just so you can see what that looks like. And now I'm going to mix this red. And just like before, I'm noticing that these are like, they're really similar. They're pretty similar. I think that to the untrained eye, you wouldn't notice the difference, but because I deal with paint so much, I can tell the difference in these paints. This one is significantly more lemony than this one. It's a little bit more warmer. And then it's just like, it's a good imitation, but it's not quite the same. Okay, and then up here, this is the cadmium-free red light lightened just a little bit more with that soft mixing white. And this one down here is going to be the regular Gamblin cadmium red light. And yeah, yet again, I think this one is a little bit warmer than this one. This one's a little bit colder to me. All right, so now I have blended some greens and purples with the cadmium yellow and red respectively, so we're gonna swatch those as well. And this is the cadmium free one. This is the one that does include cadmium, and again, I am really noticing that like the one that does include cadmium is just a significantly cooler color, and it really does bleed through in the mixes. Sorry, there's like some stray cat hairs in here. I don't know how my cat's hair gets everywhere, but somehow he just like permeates every single aspect of my life. All right, I've adjusted the camera so that hopefully you can see things a bit better. So this is the cadmium free, like sort of brownish purple kind of color. And I noticed when blending that these were like so significantly dark and like desaturated that they didn't really provide a very fair comparison. So I did mix some lighter versions just so you could like actually really see the difference. But I mean, like I said, I think this one is like just like significantly colder. I don't know, like the cadmium pigments, I didn't really realize they were like so cold of a color, but like when I was swatching them, comparing them to these cadmium free pigments, I really did like pretty dramatically notice a difference. You can see like how much colder this gray is, and I was pretty careful when I was blending to make sure that I used equal amounts of like each pigment, each paint, and I don't know, I can just really see the differences here. So now that we've compared them, let's talk about my takeaways. My biggest takeaway is that the cadmium free oil paints, they perform beautifully. You know, they're oil paints, they're gonna be fine. They have a really great buttery, sort of creamy texture, and it's just amazing. In terms of pigment though, I would say that the cadmium free paints are like a shade, like a little bit warmer than their cadmium including counterparts. And so this line is the cadmium free paints. This line is also the cadmium free paints, and then these two are the paints that include cadmium. I think that these two are like significantly colder. You can't really see it very well on camera. Hopefully I can do this with you guys in better lighting. And on camera, it's like relatively indistinguishable. I think that like to the average person, you wouldn't notice a difference. If you're just getting started and you just don't want to deal with the hassle of cadmium pigments, just use cadmium free. Like you're gonna get used to it really quickly. It's like, you know, it's just oil paint. It's the same stuff that you're used to. But if you're really experienced with oil paints and you do a lot of skin tone mixing and stuff, you might notice a difference. It might take some getting used to. Personally, I was pretty surprised at how close it was. I do really see a difference. I think that these cadmium-free paints are just a touch warmer than what I'm probably used to, but I think switching over would be pretty simple if I wanted to do that, and I'm actually really tempted. I think that the research that I uncovered about how to actually properly clean your brushes using cadmium pigments is like pretty substantial. That's a definite shift in my workflow. It would require me to have like a separate container thing with brush cleaning fluid that I don't normally use, and segregate my brushes that have cadmium pigments in them, like cadmium pigments that don't have them, and that don't have them, and that would impose like just a lot of extra thought into my painting process that I don't really want to include. So I think I will probably actually switch to the cadmium free pigments, and this is kind of a shift. I did not expect this going into this video. but I really do want to commit to having as non-toxic and environmentally friendly of a workflow as I possibly can. I think our individual environmental impacts are important things to consider. Obviously, they aren't the end-all be-all solution. Corporations, really large corporations, have to make a change to actually turn the tide of climate change, but I think individual choices are still important, even if they're just as sort of a guilt reliever. Yeah, okay, so all in all, I really do recommend the Utrecht Artist oil paints, the cadmium-free oil paints. I think they perform much better than the Duo Aqua like hue kind of thing. I didn't test this individually, but from what I do remember, when I switched from Duo Aqua to traditional oil paints, I did notice a dramatic difference in the quality of my mixes. I think the traditional oil paints are far more accurate in terms of color mixing. It's much more satisfying. You get the results that you expect. And I think that the cadmium-free oil paints, sorry, it's a tongue twister. The cadmium-free oil paints performed as I expected in terms of color mixing. They're, you know, the quality was much better than I expected going in, which is great. I am always glad to experience that. And I think it definitely did, like, convinced me to switch. I think color swatching in the process, I was like sort of doubtful. I was like, I don't know if I'm gonna switch. It's, you know, gonna be a lot of work to maintain my cadmium workflow, but like, I don't know. And I think doing the color swatches, like, the more I look at it, the more I can tell like just a little bit of a difference, but if you don't see it on camera, like, I don't blame you. It is like kind of hard to spot, and especially in this lighting. So I think I will wake up tomorrow and refilm some of the B-roll footage that I just took to show you guys really accurately what the colors actually look like. I think this lighting just does not do it justice, but I hope that this video was informative for you. I hope you actually like learned something, and I hope that if you continue to use cadmium pigments, you use them safely, not for your body. You don't have to worry about that. The pigments are ground to such a degree that like it doesn't affect you, but I hope that you consider the environment and the watershed in your painting practice. I think that this is important, and I hope you give that some thought. And if you are just starting out, if you are committed to a non-toxic workflow but want to use traditional oil paints, I really would recommend these Utrecht cadmium-free oil paints. They are available via Dick Blick or Blick Art Materials. Anyway, that is where I'm going to leave you for today's video. If you are subscribed, thank you so much. If you're not subscribed, consider it. I upload videos just like this all the time, hopefully better quality in the future as well, and on Friday. So this video is going to come out on a Tuesday, so later this week you're actually going to see a vlog where I just plan my shop update and sort of go through all of the steps involved in launching your own online shop. As I go through that, this is going to be my absolute first shop launch. I've never launched a shop before with my oil paintings. I think it's going to be a really fun, interesting experience. I'm going to be talking about like how I'm ordering prints and how I'm photographing my work and how I'm making all of this work, and it's going to be a really fun time. So consider subscribing and clicking that bell icon so you can see that when it airs, and leave a comment down below telling me what you think, and I will see you in the next one. All right, bye guys.